Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
It's old news now, but yet another hugely influential Christian leader has been caught in a breach of Christian moral ethics. Philip Yancey has acknowledged a long-standing extramarital affair. I'm not going to get into the details of this sad story. You can easily Google that for yourself. Suffice to say, though, the response to this has been tremendous. From readers of his books, people who say their lives have been changed profoundly, from podcasters and blog writers, news media and social media, from critics of evangelicals in particular, and Christianity in general, this revelation was more than a bombshell. It was like a nuclear mushroom cloud. Our listeners will remember that we had Philip on this podcast 2 years ago in March of 2023. That was episode 113. I listened to that interview again the day after I'd heard the news of his confession of this affair, and it was jarring to hear some of the things he said in that interview with us, now knowing that he had been in this indiscretion at the time he was talking to us. Scott and I unpacked a lot of that and our response to it in last week's episode. Now, some might say that we're really late to the table here. This Philip Yancey thing is already a month old, and in a month or two, it will be more or less swept to the side and largely forgotten. And yet, this is only the latest in a long list of similar stories. Internationally recognized Christian speakers, authors, pastors, and leaders like Ravi Zacharias, Bill Hybels, Jerry Falwell Jr., and the hugely influential 20th century theologian Karl Barth, and King David, the author of much of the Book of Psalms, as well as somewhat lesser-known names like Karl Lentz, Paul Tillich, Bruxy, Cavey, Reggie Joiner, and many others. We can't list them all. People who seem to have made huge positive contributions to the Christian community in a variety of different ways, but now, in response to the scandal of these revelations, the widespread general sentiment seems to be that we need to sweep all their ideas into the trash bin. The idea that because their lives were tainted, their ideas must be tainted, even dangerous. Scott and I talked last week about this public response, the decision to completely devalue the books, sermons, and videos that these men produced, toss them into a fiery trash bin, metaphorically speaking, or in some cases literally, and even criticizing people who might try to use those resources. We discussed whether those responses might be too knee-jerk, too reactionary, and overkill. But that's just our opinions. Who are we to speak on this topic? Just two guys speaking about some other guys that cross some very important lines. So I looked for some experts who are much more qualified to speak on this point than we are, and we got two highly credentialed speakers. First, Dr. Sarah Shin, a theologian and author of 3 books, who formerly served as the Associate National Director of Evangelism for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and now serves as a lecturer at Westminster Theological Centre in the UK. But most relevant to this episode, I invited Dr. Shin because she published a paper in a scholarly journal on this very question of what to do about the writings and scholarly output of great Christian thinkers, with a particular spotlight on the 20th century theologian Karl Barth and John Howard Yoder. Dr. Shin, welcome to the podcast.
It's lovely to be here with you, though I wish it were about a slightly different topic. Thank you for having me.
And we also have, as a second guest, Dr. Karen Swallow-Prior, who is currently the 2025-2026 Carlson Scholar at Bethel Seminary in Arden Hills, Minnesota, a highly sought-after speaker and author, a respected voice in evangelical thought. She writes a monthly column for Religion News Service, and her writings have also appeared in Christianity Today, the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Vox, the Gospel Coalition, and many other publications. Dr. Swallow-Prior, welcome to the podcast as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, before we get into our discussion, I want the audience to know that we've previously agreed on some guardrails in this conversation. Both our guests already know about these lines, but I also want the audience to know so they don't criticize us later for not talking about this or that aspect of the subject, which those listeners feel needed to have been said or explored. So first, we're not going to dwell on any specific details of the sexual affairs or abuses, none of the salacious details. So if you're wanting that, you're going to be quite disappointed. Instead, again, we're narrowly focusing our conversation on the question of what to do now with the writings and ideas of these previously quite influential theologians, writers, and pastors. Second, the scenarios we'll be talking about will be of people engaging in extramarital affairs, which will arguably have been mutually consensual. We're not talking about Christian leaders who committed sexual assault or abuses, priests abusing children, or cults forcing sex on their adherents. This is solely about people, and it seems they're all men, who have been hugely impactful on Christian thinking and Christian ministry while having engaged in an extramarital affair. And I know that all four of us here already know this, but do any of the three of you want to comment further on those parameters?
I just want to observe, for the sake of the advocate communities that I'm part of, the survivor advocate communities I'm part of, that the term extramarital affair, when applied in relationships that have huge power differentials, that is not always the correct term. So obviously those things do exist. The line can be blurry, but I think we need to acknowledge that sometimes affairs do cross into abuse. And so we will have to be talking about that, even if we aren't using that term in that conversation.
Absolutely. Sarah?
The article that I wrote that I will be discussing is about the question of how do we read influential thinkers. I refrain from using the term great, just because, again, I think that presets the stage a certain way. But one of them has to do with a thinker that had a long-standing extramarital relationship, and the other one is about an influential theologian who had a long history of abuse. I'm not going to go into great detail about that, but they bring up different questions about how do we read. It's really the question of how do we read that is the primary concern. So I'm trying to stay within the strictures of what you're saying, but overall, the question I'm trying to ask is how do we read these guys, if at all?
Right. Exactly. Okay. Sarah, then why don't we begin with you? You wrote this academic paper, published in a scholarly journal, Studies in Christian Ethics, the title of which is The Challenge of Biography, Reading Theologians in Light of Their Breached Sexual Ethics. So, Sarah, could you give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch of that paper?
Sure. So, as I've just stated, the question that I was wrestling with is how do we read two particular theologians as case scenarios, given that we are finding out problematic aspects of their lives, but also that these are highly influential theologians. And I share that as a theologian, as an academic that's thinking about teaching others. And so the two particular figures are Karl Barth, who had a long-standing extramarital relationship with a woman named Charlotte von Kirschbaum. And then we have John Howard Yoder. And it's been well documented that he actually had a history of serial spiritual sexual abuse with many, many women. And so the issue is these two guys have had quite a lot of influence in theological education and the formation of theology. How should we read them? Should we read them at all? So it all intersects with these questions. So to actually try to come up with a way of highlighting where we're coming into places of disagreement, where different terms or premises are being used, I use the work of an analytic theologian named Samir Yadav. I believe he's Indian American. He's really kind. He gave me so much time where I was trying to understand what he was doing. And so he came up with 3 typologies to try to answer the question of when, in a different conversation, when Willie James Jennings says that when you're talking about race and white supremacy, he says that supersessionism, the idea that the church replaces Israel, that is linked with white supremacy and racism. So he's like, okay, when Jennings says that, he's like, I'm not trying to prove here that that's absolutely unimpeachable. Like, if that's true, can you just say supersessionism and then know what to do? And he argues that actually, you don't actually know how supersessionism, or the belief that the church replaces Israel, you don't know how it's at play. Is it in the kind of the thought world of what's being taught and believed? Is it in the practices, or is it in something else? So I found that really helpful, because his whole argument was, if you actually don't know where the problem is happening, then you come up with a solution that doesn't actually come up with a proper remedy. So it was like it's a viral infection, you give someone medicine for a bacterial infection, that sort of. So basically, then I look at two different theologians that address the biography and the ethical issue raised by Karl Barth's biography, and then also look at similar things for Yoder. And I adapt Yadav's typology. So I say, okay, is the issue like, okay, then the theology is the issue, so we should examine the theology and see what's wrong, right? Or is it actually about the way the institutions present these figures, that's what's really wrong? There's practices and things. Or a third way is actually is both the theology and the way that the institutions practice kind of like teaching about these theologians. My argument is that type three is actually the only way to actually not perpetuate the issues and the ideas, because I talk about how when we're arguing about these things that sometimes people say, well, this person has too much value in their theology, so how can you throw that out? It's just too valuable. And so the inherent problem then is you're then pitting the value of a theologian who has had a lot of power and influence against the suffering of those. So I'm like, the value question inherently is problematic. But I'm like, but if it's about influence, and influence then understands that, someone that's highly influential, their ideas are everywhere, whether you realize it or not. Right. So whether you're intending or not, their ideas have helped construct our realities, helped construct our practices and how we think about faith and church and being a Christian. So if you think about influence, then you want to actually think about where is the influence happening in our ideas, in our practices, in both. So with Barth, I look at a guy named Stephen Plant, who's a Barth scholar. He addresses what the reality of Barth's life, and he's like, okay, let's look at aspects of his theology, about marriage. And so I'm like, well, okay, that's interesting. But then Rachel Moores, who's a female theologian in the UK, she kind of goes back and critiques him, and it's these are long articles, right? But she actually her emphasis is actually we need to think about how our institutions like practice theology, and so she's leaning towards practice, that the way we teach that's what really needs to change. And in the end, I analyze these two and I say, actually, the first guy doesn't sufficiently deal with the reality that Barth is often spoken as someone that helped influence the German confessing church. He's kind of taught as a paragon of like kind of ethical ideals, right? But I'm like, but no one wants to talk about this, even though for 30 years, different scholars, women scholars have written about this and tried to say, hey, there was a woman buried under all this silence, and that was the woman that was not his wife, his co-writer in a lot of his theology, Charlotte Kirschbaum. So I'm like, okay, so here's the debate. With Yoder, similarly, what you have is Hauerwas, Stanley Hauerwas, influential American theologian, and so he's like naming, okay, this is a crisis. What do we do with Yoder? And he's like, well, I don't think we should throw out Yoder because I think there's stuff in his theology that can be really actually helpful in encountering the very problems that he perpetuated. Another American theologian, Hilary Scarzella, a feminist trauma theologian, she claps back, and she kind of writes, "Hey, like actually, there's a number of problems in the ways you've addressed this, and again, trying to protect Yoder's family against actually those that have suffered. There's a whole host of problems, but she's like, actually, we really need to center our theology on survivors' experiences and learn from them, so that we can help build the ecclesial spaces that don't perpetuate Yoder's logic, right? So you're seeing again like a type one response with Hauerwas. He's like, well, let's look at the theology and try to figure out how do we like fix it. And with Scarzella, she's kind of somewhere in between a type two and type three, where she's like, okay, we need to learn from these experiences so that we can better then embody a different way of being church. And what I want to ask there, and what I ask in the article is, okay, so how are you going to take those experiences of those survivors, which is really valuable? How do you transmit that to the rest of the world? Because right now you're talking about a separate space. That's really valuable. We need to learn that, but how does that get transmitted? So it's not fully a type three in my mind, because we don't have a way of transmitting that learning to the rest. And my goal is, how do we get the church and ecclesial spaces and educational spaces to change, right? To acknowledge what we've inherited.
Right.
And by the end, I basically do the work of like looking at the theology, then addressing the practices, and then proposing a type three response to both theologians. And in the end, I write that it's more like almost like theology and kind of learning in churches. It's like learning computer. We all run in a computer code, in terms of there's a language and a way of life that's been written in. We all run on a code, and the previous thinkers that had a lot of influence, they helped write this code. If you want to write a different code, a different way of being, you have to understand how that code was written so that you can write a new code, so that you can change the malformed code. So that's like the layperson's way of speaking of it. And so I try to show what that could look like by demonstrating that. So I hope that was like clear enough. It's like hard to know what will be fully communicated.
Right. Well, you did cover a lot of ground there, and I want to make sure that the audience gets what you're talking about when you refer to type 1, type 2, and type 3. You did explain it, but let's just take a few minutes and go through those a bit more carefully. And you made comparisons to infections. That's a biological or a medical analogy that you're using.
We want to be careful with like the medical infections or because sometimes it's been deployed unhelpfully in Christian spaces. But whether it's medical or if it's like the programming, the idea of like malformed code, those things can help. So if like someone were to say, okay, so Barth's theology is really valuable, so we got to figure out what are the problematic parts, and so let's focus on his ideas of marriage. And you can demonstrate like a number of things where I'm like, okay, well, for me, I'm like, when I'm looking at his views on marriage, it's a bit idealistic. I'm like, if the ideal person, if male, female, and the ideal is coming together and it's most fulfilled in marriage, then I'm like, what do you do with people that aren't married? What do you do with people that are single or divorced, like, or and divorced or not married for multiple reasons, right? So I'm like, already for me, his life forces me to examine his theology. And that's an example of type one, where I'm like, that's a type one response. But that doesn't deal with type two, which is how do our institutions practice like the learning and transmission of ideas, where actually they teach a lot about Barth and the greatness of his thought, but they don't actually teach about this aspect of his life. And then actually then connect it to then how do we read his theology about human relating, about gender, about male and female. And also they don't talk at all. They're willing to talk about other male contemporaries, but they don't actually talk about the ways that his ideas were influenced by Charlotte von Kirschbaum, who was the other in the triad, right? Like I don't want to use terms that are not helpful. And so I'm like, okay, that's a problem. Like if you want to actually show who this person is and his influences, speak of all of his influences. And so a type three response that deals with the thought as well as our practice of how we teach and how we transmit theological education means you then, given this problematic biography, you look at a part of the theology that you're wondering what might have gone wrong. Where might we be wise to pay particular attention since this had to do with relationships, sexual relationships? Okay, what's happening there? But then also, how do we teach? So with Yancey, right? I mean, like, okay, where did he write about marriage, about adultery, and then how do we speak of Yancey? That would kind of be a correlated thing. And so I did something similar with Yoder, but I hope that gets the point across.
It's the type 2 that I think listeners really need to get a good idea of what you're getting at here. So again, we're talking in type 2 we're addressing the policies and the institutions. So let me see if this fits your type 2 infections in the theological setting. The seminaries and the churches that teach that women are secondary. Mm-hmm. They're given by God to men for men's benefits, that God favors certain men over others, that women can't hold authority, making them sit in different places in the church. Or we could talk about accountability structures and the oversight and supervision. These will be examples of what you mean by type 2.
I think with type 1, it'd be like, what is the theology that's being taught? But with type 2, it might be, okay, what's actually being practiced in churches? Because you can even have a church that says that they believe in women in ministry, but actually, and this is where Samir Yadav, he talks about beliefs versus a-leaves. Beliefs are the things you expressly say you believe. But a-leaves are the things that you subconsciously believe and it impacts your practice, and you don't even know you believe it. It's like someone that says, like, I'm not sexist, but they end up doing sexist things, right? Or someone that says, I'm not racist, but they end up doing racist things. Like their a-leaves, their implicit biases sometimes counteract. And so what like if a church were saying, Yeah, like, we believe in women in ministry or different things like that, but then they're actually doing a number of things that are problematic and push against actually women thriving in ministry. That would also add some texture to what you're describing as type two. A church that both uses theological reasoning and practices to say that women shouldn't lead, like that's also that would probably take both type one and type two. But then
Right.
that proves my point, which is that you need to address both.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It seems is it particularly challenging with somebody like Bart because in that case, the woman that he was involved with,
Mhm.
she's part of his thought. Like in fact, we're not even sure. I don't think anybody even knows how to unwind her voice from his, right? Because it's very unclear in the dogmatics and so on. Like you said, in some cases, it's like a co-authorship almost, you know. So that adds another, or I'm asking, I guess, does that add another dimension to the issue in his case?
Yeah, I think that's right. There are four of the five. The fifth volume was not completed, but every single volume of the Church Dogmatics, arguably one of the most influential set of modern systematic theologies written in the past century, previous century. Charlotte von Kirschbaum helped write them.
Yeah,
When she got dementia and she ended up in a nursing home, like he could not able to complete it without her. And so, I'm like, so if the idea is, well, if we speak of her, then do we tarnish the legacy of this great theologian? I'm like, well, so then will you bury her? For me, I'm like, if there was an abuse that's happened, it's that the guild has buried her, all of her work. I'm not interested in making them saints. I don't think they are at all.
yeah,
But at
yeah.
least let's speak of them rightly, and let's not bury all the work that she did, that alongside of him. And so then actually let's build a better future theologically, especially with someone who's been that influential across the globe.
Yeah, when I started studying art many years ago now, like it's been known forever that he had this relationship. And in my recollection, it was kind of like, well, yeah, we're not sure what it really was. Was it sexual? Was it not? But it was kind of just passed over, just mentioned and then passed over, as opposed to, no, this is pretty big. This is really important. Should we then? Do we need to reevaluate? And then to Karen's point, given Bart's authority in a sense and his position and so on, it wasn't an abuse of his power. This whole relationship, was it a healthy thing or was it kind of an abusive relationship? And I haven't seen that explored too much at all.
There has been, I think a number of people are hesitant to say like that it was or it wasn't. They're like, how can you fully know? And so for me, what I chose to say was what I can say is that someone who labored to help produce a series of writings that is supposed to benefit the church, that they have been sidelined and buried. And I think that's just like I'm
Yeah,
like, that's what I can name more clearly. Yeah.
right.
Okay, so there's a lot of things that I want to unpack from your book, Sarah, but I think we'd also like to bring in Karen into the conversation. Karen, you've written sporadically and very recently with this Phil Yancey. I think you began a thread and it didn't seem to go too much further. Maybe share some of your perspectives on what we've been saying so far and your postings on this.
Mm. Yeah, so again, my expertise is literature, and so I've thought and written more about what we do with artists who live these kinds of lives, that troublesome lives, but I'll put that aside for now. But with Yancey, you sort of the immediate response that I saw and that I responded to was people who looked, he carved out a certain persona of humility and gentleness and grace. And so there are some, let's be honest, there are some leaders who might get revealed as abusers or adulterers, and it's not that surprising, right? Because because of their narcissistic behaviors or their abuses of authority that are already on display. But when someone like Yancey, who is beloved, and I heard from many people who said that he basically saved their faith through his writings, so there's a level of betrayal and hurt when someone like that is exposed for, being unfaithful. And so I was responding to that, and And, and just you talking about literature, because he is someone who is, widely read, gentle in spirit, circumspect. And so my question was kind of, why is he not circumspect enough to have, to have predicted that this could not end well? Not that, not everyone just operates through logic, but I guess, that's also hard for me to understand. um, and so I have a book in progress, so this isn't something that is published yet, but in this book in progress, in my proposal, I do talk a little bit more about this, because the other response that we saw immediate responses, some from fellow adulterers and abusers in the church who are in leadership, saying, oh, we must remember this can happen to anyone, that, we're all one step away from falling, or this kind of moral failure. That was the immediate response of many leaders. But experts and researchers in these matters, in abuse and adultery, point out, and there's research that I looked into, and I include this in my work in progress. No, this doesn't necessarily happen to everyone, that there are people who exhibit character qualities that are more prone to these abusive behaviors and these, behaviors that lack integrity. And so it becomes more troublesome in some ways when someone like Yancey, who theoretically did not apparently exhibit these behaviors, at least in his public persona, does this. That's a different kind of reckoning and wrestling that people have to do. And so that's what I'm working on in the work that I'm writing. But again, I think another element of this is just simply celebrity status and the power and platforms that we give in our celebrity worshiping culture. There's something systemic, I think, that almost even the gentle, seemingly non-narcissistic personalities can fall prey to this celebrity machine that defines our culture now.
And Sarah, in your paper, you also were getting at quite a bit at the fact that could very well be a systemic issue. Maybe you could respond to that.
Yeah, I wrote about, again, the difference between value and influence, and how much not like making it something about value really sidelines the whole conversation, right? So if you were to say like Yancey had brought so much value, he saved someone, from the brink of like being stepping into like unbelief or different things like that. And so he has value, right? And so he has to be saved, even, does that make sense? So like there's a value which is about negative, positive, then it's about like, I value this, Yancey, you do not, because whatever. And so it ends up being just a fight about value. Versus if it's about influence and saying, okay, like, what do we do here? Like, how do we address this? It's much quicker and faster to make a value-based decision of like, cancel, keep. It's binary, right?
Right.
Versus one that's about influence is like, where did he influence? Like, what if that influence is still something that might actually provide something that could be helpful? What if that influence has things that clearly maybe are questionable? I don't even mean that it's clearly like bad. Like there might be like gray zone. I'm like, the gray zone should still trouble us, right? But it takes work. It takes work to unpack and to understand like what's going on there. But I think the influence-based kind of self-reflection and critical reflection for Christians and Christian leaders in terms of the Yancey situation is like, okay, if he has been influential, deeply influential, where has he been? What parts of his writing or his thoughts have been influential? If you learn more about what happened, like what parts of that bring up questions for you, and how has it impacted your own practice of faith, or even the ways you speak of, of the Christian life from the pulpit? That takes work. But I don't think we're going to be able to make it's not a quick fix, sort of thing. I think we want quick fixes, especially when the world seems like it's falling apart. But actually, I think we need leaders, pastors, educators that are willing to do the hard work of wrestling. So I think for me, I remember when there was a similar situation, a little different, with Mike Pilavachi. He was a sole survivor leader, a big figure in England with the Anglican Church. And it came out that he had inappropriate contact with younger men. And one of our pastors came out with a statement, but like, "Hey, we're working through what this means." And almost a year later, like, we asked the independent agency to like review what we do in our practices. But also, he's like, "My fear was, what did I take on that I don't even realize?" And I was like, for him to say that in a sermon, and for him to say, like, that is the fear. I don't know what I don't know. I was like, that has credibility to me because he is not coming from a place of like arrogance and hubris of like, oh no, I could never. He was like, I don't know. And so I need someone who is not going to try to protect me at all costs to actually look at how I'm leading and give me feedback. That felt like the hard work of introspection that deals with the data and looks at what's happening.
Is there a bit of a similarity between what's going on in our greater culture as well right now, like pulling down all our statues and changing our memorials, and as we reckon with our own past, right? Especially in the West, and things like imperialism and slavery, and it's ugly, when you get into the past, very ugly. And then the question is, well, should we still have a statue to this guy? Should we still revere them? Are there things that they said that have seeped into our cultural psyche that we need to deal with? It just seems like there's almost a parallel to what's going on in our culture. I was saying to Luke before we came on, the Epstein files, now that we're discovering, even if they didn't do anything criminal, just the lewdness of these various men, these leaders who are tended to be looked up to and revered for being very successful and so on. Now we're getting a glimpse into their dark side. What do we do with that, right? So it just seems like this whole thing, both in the religious institutions and in our culture in general,
Yeah.
is coming
I
to a
think,
head these days.
and that
Go ahead.
name's for me the reason why I did the work to write the article. For me, it is what do you do as someone that identifies as Christian, right? Grew up in America, that was in ministry for like 20 years and is now like teaching people that are pastors. I'm like, what do you do with a troubled inheritance?
Mm.
Whether it's sexual, like sex, gender, marriage, whether what's race, like and slavery. And I just taught a class on the Reformation to courage to my students, and my students are aged 20 to 82. They're British, and I remember thinking this is my first time teaching this kind of class, to a room where that's going to have the children of those were the descendants of the enslaved and the descendants of the enslavers in the same room. Like I don't know what that feels like in a British context. And I remember thinking, I'm not going to teach you the Reformation history that standard textbooks say is the way it's going to be taught, because with the Reformation in the UK, right, came actually the Protestant proliferation and participation in the transatlantic slave trade. It also concurrently came with actually a lot of things that happened in Northern Ireland and the displacing of Irish persons by Scottish and English settlers. But the thing is, my students don't know this. They know that there's tension with Northern Ireland and Ireland, right? And there was this moment where one of the students who's Black, he was asking questions. Finally, I was like, did you all not learn about the slave trade? Because I'm like, I grew up public education. I learned about the slave trade, like New Jersey. That's, where I went to school. And not a single one had learned about it in school. And the Anglican Church in the UK is talking about reparations. I'm like, how do you have a conversation about reparations that you're saying you're willing to have when none of your congregants know anything about the slave trade? And so, but I think overall, like as we were going through things, I told them, look, I'm not telling you these things because I want you to despise the faith. I don't want to teach you something that you have to discard later. I want you to be able to, if Reformation history is like going through a burial ground, a garden that has beautiful plants, but also a lot of gravestones. You don't know which gravestone is the marker of a hero or a villain. It might be the same for two different people. You don't know what's a weed or a flowering plant. You don't know what's a rock or like so I'm like, actually doing Reformation history is actually very complex, and we're all going to have complex like. And one of the women, who's Jamaican, she grew up partly in Jamaica and then came over. She asked, she's like, we learned about this in Jamaica, but in the UK, in England, there's a lot of contention. They say it's too divisive. Like, what do you think? And I remember just looking at her because for me, my mentors, a number of them are Black American pastors, right? And I said, if you can't remember together, then you can't reconcile.
Mm.
Not having a common memory, which actually is a huge problem, right? In America and in history and in the church, like that makes it impossible to, if you can't remember rightly, you can't reconcile and you can't move forward together as a church. So those were just some recent things that I was experiencing that connects with this.
Yeah, it's interesting when you tend to hear about the slavery issue in evangelical circles, the talk is all about Wilberforce, the one kind of bright light. But, okay, that's great. But there's this whole other side, right, where there was a lot of complicity as well. So your discussion of the Reformation is very poignant to me because I went through that when I studied the Reformation because I had looked up to these guys. These are the Protestant heroes, right? These are the good guys. And I came out of it thinking, yeah, there really weren't any good guys. They were all a bunch of rapscallions, and some were a little
Yeah.
better than others. And like that's just the muddiness of real life, as opposed to
Yeah.
idealized.
There's a book that came out with University Press called Ownership, and it's about Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, and John Wesley, and yeah, and their stances towards slavery. And so, and it's actually Wesley who only like maybe like 37 years later, after first seeing contact, that he changes his mind and
Mhm.
he becomes, vocally anti-slavery. But I remember reading through that and then actually showing the class this and talking about this because I'm like, hey, you guys talk about Whitfield in glowing terms. I'm like, I could not do that in the States. I learned a long time ago, like Whitfield is complicated. And it was so interesting seeing them process. Like, actually, it seems like because Wesley really cares about discipleship and repentance, he changes his mind and he becomes, right, an influential force on what later comes with abolitionism in the UK. And I think seeing that, I kind of was like, it can happen. Like, you can actually bring in, right, this kind of critical reflection. And they're like, yes, this is our inheritance. And yet I'm learning about seeing someone change. So it's not about them being a perfect hero. I think we have to stop teaching about these perfect heroes. We're
Mhm.
sinners. But then we also need to learn from how they change.
Yeah.
Right. I'd like to bring us back to this question. While we were talking about systemic issues, I'm a fixer. That's my inherent character trait. I like to fix things and I need to know what the problem is so I can fix it. So one of the things that both of you, all three of you actually have talked about are systemic issues that might be contributing to why we have problematic thinking and the problematic theologian type 1, but type 2, the systemic issues. And so this is at heart a sexual issue. We've talked about the attitudes that the church, the seminaries teach about women, the attitudes regarding sex itself. There was some talk a little bit about accountability issues. And I know, Karen, you've written in the past about accountability and structures. And so can we talk about some of those systemic issues that give us this problem that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the systemic issues flow from the type 1 problem, right? From the thinking to the practice. But especially in America, we are so individualistic. People have a hard time wrapping their mind around systemic issues and understanding that, we are social creatures and our institutions are social as well. I love the metaphor that I actually don't like scientific or computer metaphors that much, but the one about coding really made sense to me, that we have, that we have to, if we want to recode something, we actually have to know the original code to know what's wrong with it and fix it. And I think this idea of influence is very, very helpful, the value versus influence, because influence gets at the systemic issues, right? And so one way we can, when we're talking about heroes and great figures or valuable influences, I think we need to look at what their influence is, as Sarah said, when it comes to reading books or monuments. A great example to illustrate this is Martin Luther King Jr. People, so he has these sexual improprieties in his past. And so people, might want to take down a monument or not celebrate his day. Well, the monuments and the celebrations are not about his influence as a husband and a father. They are about his influence in civil rights. But when we have monuments to someone because of their service in upholding the slave trade, like that's an influence that we need to wrestle with. So I think one very sort of simple and clear way of beginning to cut through our own individual and systemic influences is to see, what is the influence on? Is someone being celebrated and read for this particular issue, or is it for something else? And that's one sort of dividing line, especially, as I said, I've talked about what do we do with artists who are, highly immoral, wicked people? Do we still read their works? I can think of Charles Dickens, for example, who treated his wife horrifically. But I don't read Charles Dickens novels because I'm trying to get marriage advice or because I trust what he says about women. In fact, I've never trusted what he says about women. So I'm reading those works and being influenced in a way that's not directly tied to his bad behavior. And so I think that's just one sort of slice that we can make, is to say, what area of influence does this thinker, writer, artist have? And is that what are we allowing ourselves to be influenced in this area where they have fallen short, or something else? Not that we can compartmentalize everything, but I think that's one way of beginning to see through the problems.
I think with like the idea of like statues, I remember there in the height of that kind of debates about statues, there was the statue of Robert E. Lee, and someone had projected Harriet Tubman onto that statue. And there were like a bunch of texts, like pro Black Lives Matter, all this stuff. But I was like, that is interesting, because now you are faced with two different stories clashing. And what do you learn from that versus just taking down the statue? Right. Because I think part of it is like, how do we learn so that then we can build a better future? And we need that dialogue, and different people are at different places where they can have that dialogue. I think when we're talking then even about like the Philip Yancey stuff, part of me is like, I'm always aware, I'm like, when a pastor's preaching, is like the happy ending always about finding the perfect one and getting married and having lots of kids? There's a way even quietly we reinforce a certain very romantic narrative about what happiness and the happy life in Jesus is. And then the Christian's like, I should have that. I don't have that. And so, and so there's all these ways, even our thought world is systemically kind of reinforced, especially in evangelical land, and that we need to rethink.
And that, that's actually my book, The Evangelical Imagination, which is really about the evangelical social imaginaries. I draw on Charles Taylor. I mean, that's really what you're talking about here, is the way that we have these precognitive, unconscious ideas and expectations that, we could say we believe one thing, as you said earlier, but we're acting in an opposite way because of these underlying assumptions that we don't even know that we have. And that's what we need to interrogate.
Could I jump in on that? Because I had an idea and I wasn't sure I should share it. I have it ready just in case. But when you refer to earlier, just a few minutes ago, Karen, you used the word compartmentalize, and then both you, Sarah, and Karen were talking about the evangelical imagination and the evangelical thought life. This is what I wanted to put on the table. So tell me if there's any merit in what I'm going to say here, that we want to know if this is a systemic problem, and I wonder if it is systemic in part because Christianity equips people in how to compartmentalize incongruities and rationalize away paradoxes. We learn those skills from childhood all the way up through our adult years. So I'll speak for myself. For decades, I learned how to compartmentalize my young earth worldviews on Sundays while I went to university and became a scientist and studied evolution during the rest of the week. And I learned to keep my religious views quiet to avoid the negative reception that they would get from my secular colleagues. I learned how to hold two contrasting ideas together and dismiss the obvious incongruities again. The concept of three persons in one, the virgin birth, Jesus being fully human and yet fully divine. And I learned how to quell the cognitive dissonance, to compartmentalize that too. We learned how to see things that looked really bad as actually good. The Canaanite slaughters in the Old Testament being part of God's plan, for example, or failed answers to desperate prayers as God's ways being higher than ours. Tragedies becoming things that the devil intended for evil, but God intended for good. We learned how to not reveal our deep inner truths and beliefs to our secular friends, and how to hide our deepest doubts and private indiscretions from our Christian friends. And so this is my point. We're always flexing these muscles of compartmentalizing uncomfortable truths, dismissing paradoxes, and hiding our deep inner truths. And we practice that. We as Christians practice that from childhood and onward, all the way through to adulthood. And we get really good at that. So is that setting the stage? And this is the systemic issue I'm asking then. Is that setting the stage for a Karl Barth recategorizing his mistress as actually being the helpmeet that God gave him to help him develop his theology? Or Ravi Zacharias justifying the sexual favors he extracted from certain women, telling at least one of them that she was his reward from God for his lifelong service to the ministry, and comparing his actions to the Old Testament patriarchs who had multiple wives? Or Philip Yancey keeping a straight face and full composure in front of a church audience while continuing his extramarital relationship for 8 years? Is it our inherent ability to compartmentalize and dismiss the uncomfortable truths? Is that part of the systemic issue?
I think that we are, as Christians, trained to do this compartmentalization to varying degrees. I think you've described it pretty accurately. But what I also want to say, and I don't know what to do with it, but I also want to say, with having immersed myself too much today in a social media feed that is overflowing with the images and correspondence from the Epstein files, that people like that, who are doing the kinds of things that these files seem to indicate they've done, don't compartmentalize necessarily or as much, because they don't need to. They don't seem to have had a problem with anything that they were doing. And so I need to hold both of those in each hand, because the compartmentalization is not good. And for Christians, it's antithetical to what we are supposed to be and who we are supposed to be and who we are supposed to be like. And yet the world does these things without compartmentalizing. And so I guess maybe the answer I'm coming up with as I say this is that we have a problem in Christianity in rejecting Christ.
So for me, when I'm thinking about what are the layers, the systemic layers and practices that might be, the compartmentalization layer is probably the most abstracted. I'm not saying that it's not, but the thing is, compartmentalization isn't also just like a purely Christian thing, right? I mean, Western philosophy like compartmentalize all kinds of things, like, well, hold up these philosophical greats and they have certain values about their peers and they're like terrible to like anyone that's poor or a woman or a slave. So I'm like, already before Christ, you already have. So I don't think it's a uniquely Christian kind of phenomena. I think that
except that we teach, like, it's the Christian thing to do, is teach your children right from year one on, teach them how to learn to hold incongruities and dismiss the cognitive dissonance. We train all of them this way.
So I think for me, this is where I'm like, evangelicalism range as a whole. Like I did not grow up in a space where compartmentalization was as severe as what you've described. And so I think even Christians grow up in a whole range of spaces, so, and I think for me also going into, like, I did my undergrad at MIT, like, so my friends were scientists that had wrestled through and were drawing together these incongruencies about what certain Christians had said and whatnot. And there's a whole range, right? So, but I think the difference between mystery and paradox and just incongruent, faulty teaching, there's like different things happening there. But I think I do think there is a compartmentalization problem that will be more severe in different spaces and practices. It depends on your setting. But I think in the end, more than that, I think it's idolatry. It's unchecked idolatry, right? That might say, then we'll compartmentalize so that we can protect this idolatry. We're going to uphold this speaker or this pastor. He or she is so great. And so we're going to almost revere them. Like, we want to worship something or follow something as our God instead of God himself. And so I think the question of what is compartmentalization serving? Is it in some ways like this idea of God or idea of Jesus versus like Jesus himself? And so if we actually, in following like a constructed version of God, a constructed version of Jesus versus actually wrestling with the text, wrestling with what it says, wrestling with like, I'm like, I remember hearing a New Testament scholar say, like, look, if Romans and Galatians weren't the heart of the Protestant faith, and instead the Gospels were, where it talks about like caring for the poor, it's like we'd all be screwed. And I was like, well, that's really interesting, right? Like, I'm like, what are you gonna do with that? But and so I'm like, we have to wrestle with. But I do think, when you have these big name famous people that name their ministries after themselves, I'm like always like, oh my, like what are you inviting in there? Like I think we have to ask, like, what is it that we want to place so much faith and hope in a human, right? When especially living humans, where until they've made it to the end, we won't know. And even when they've made it to the end, like sometimes we're like, oh my gosh, like Jean Vanier, he helped a lot of like formed communities for persons with disability, and it's been found out that he actually was abusive with female caregivers, and now the disability community has been like really reeling from that.
Yeah.
But I think at the heart of it is idolatry, and we want to serve something other than God. It makes us feel safe. It makes us feel secure. I think evangelical is so like you're almost like forming a bigger offense around whatever you think Jesus or God should be like. And again, it's easier just to follow these rules versus doing the hard wrestling of like, you don't make sense to me, God. Like I'm like, if a pastor were to get him and say, I really wrestle with the Lord this week because things happen and I hold to this part of scripture and I'm living in the tension that this doesn't make sense to me right now. And I am your pastor. Like if pastors could do that and actually embody the fact that sometimes we can't make, and faith is not about having all the answers,
Right.
I think we do tremendous good. But that's not a lot of times how the pulpit is used. And I think that like there's an aggressive certainty that has to be projected, and then that's seen as a standard of faith. I think that sets them a whole edifice and a structure and a system of false belief.
Right.
Well, to your point, in the case of a church, you have a lot of people coming on Sunday full of doubt, and they're looking to the pastor to be certain. They're looking to the pastor to be their doubt fixer. My life's full of doubt and screw ups and so on, but that guy up there, he's solid. And so I can kind of attach myself to that. And if I look up and he's struggling with the same things, well, there's no hope. I mean, that's, you know what I mean?
I mean, but I'm like, if the preacher consistently never shares about struggle, and I'm like, I don't know. I have some questions. Because I'm like, I don't think a single human, no matter how long they've been following Jesus, like I don't think they're perfect.
No,
Right.
no.
And it doesn't have to be about, sexual activity. But I'm like, yeah, it's like we're all sinners. And if anything, leaders are called to try not to live a fake life of faith. And that
Yeah,
means also sharing where they're struggling. I just think so many more people would actually be humbled to know that their dark night of the soul and wrestling with the Lord, that it's not faithlessness,
right,
yeah.
right.
All right, we're getting short on time. We have covered a lot of ground, and there's a ton more that we could cover. But I do want to make sure that we talk about the path to restitution. What do we do once one of these breaches of traditional Christian sexual ethics has occurred? Is there a way to restore the person and their teachings, as well as the institutions and practices that they infected? Getting back to Dr. Shin's type 3 infection analogy. So I mentioned three things there. Let's begin with the teachings. Is it possible to sift through their writings and sermons and set aside the ones that are tainted or even suspect and label the rest as okay for public consumption? Can we do that?
I think overall, when we teach, I would, especially with people where there's been like no breach sexual ethics, I would say that for the pastor, the educator, being real about that and saying, hey, this is the context. This person's very influential. Like, we're going to look at their theology. We're going to maybe look at a particular aspect. But for me, I'm like, I don't think it's just the sexual ethics that's probably breached. There's probably other connected. Theology is always interconnected, right? So I wouldn't want to prescribe, like, we're just going to look at this section K and A through Z, and then as long as we don't deal with K, we're okay. I'm like, no, I think K is connected to L and J, like there's a lot of things going on. The Yoder case is interesting because when the Mennonites were trying to confront Yoder, and at this point, Yoder is the most powerful. He's the founder of a lot of the theological systems. They used his theology to try to restore his relationship with his accusers. But the thing is, he was using Matthew 19, like, and they didn't actually deal with power. They didn't, Matthew 18, 19. They didn't deal with the
18, yeah.
18, yeah, and with power differentials. And so actually it really didn't work. And so that's actually an example where like his theology, for me, I look at him like, oh, like I'm learning from this example of how the victims actually were not served by this theology. But I'm also learning later by actually what happened. What was problematic in a number of those things was the leaders of the seminaries and others were saying like, well, he's too influential. We want to restore him to his position. I'm like, well, you know what? I don't know if restoration to Christian community is about restoring an influential person back to power. Restoring them back to community? Sure, yes. Like they're beloved by God, they repent. But actually restoring them back when they haven't actually repented. I was looking at a church, early church creeds. I think one of the all the extra sort of, I guess, discussions that are happening in early church creeds was if a man or woman has been found guilty of adultery, that penance takes 7 years. I'm not talking like penance in the medieval sense, but I was like, I don't even know what that penance involved. But I was like, wow, we have come a long way. That for 7 years, they have to somehow live a life that demonstrates that they know what they did was wrong and that they're going to try to actually live rightly. That's really different than our current context.
Right. Actually, I read at some point, it was a medieval response to something like this, and it wasn't 7 years, it was 20. And I've forgotten the exact details, but it was like 7 years you weren't even allowed in the church, but you had to be at the door either every day or every Sunday, crying for forgiveness, confessing your sin. Then there was 7 years where you were allowed in the front door, but you couldn't get into the sanctuary.
Yeah, I don't think the first, 500
Yeah,
years of the
but
church quite did that.
it was prescribed, and it was 20 years that you basically were pleading for forgiveness and restitution before the people would fully accept you again.
And that feels like, to me, I'm like, that feels extreme, right?
Yeah.
But I think overall, like usually when people are talking about how do you restore an individual that's fallen, they're automatically thinking, how do you restore them back to their place of power? I'm like, why do we make that jump? Like, why do we restore them back to power and influence? I don't think that that's actually, and all of that is based on because their thought is so valuable. We have to free them to continue to, produce the valuable output. And I'm like, how do you know what's valuable? You haven't done the work, so
Karen, any thoughts?
I mean, I guess this is a sort of simple. But we are to test all things, and Augustine says that all truth comes from the Lord, and we can use that truth. So we can sift through the theology, the thinking. At some point, there may be thinkers and influences that are so rotten at the foundation and so rotten in the fruit that the sifting isn't worthwhile. But I think that we can still continue the sifting and seeking truth wherever it might be found.
Scott, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I certainly wholeheartedly agree with that. Whenever I hear about, getting rid of books, kind of burning books. Christians are good at that, and I tend to think that's not the way to go. I think the other thing I think is that it's somewhat of an individual thing, maybe too. That, for example, take Philip Yancey. His best book, in my opinion, What's So Amazing About Grace, to me it's a great book, and I think it'll stand the test of time. But if I were to reread that today, I would read it very differently. And that would be partly personal in the sense that I've been personally hurt. I looked up to somebody and maybe I shouldn't have, maybe I idealized them and and so on. But I was very disappointed. So there's an emotional side of it too. And so I would read it very differently. But in 100 years, when somebody's completely detached from all that, they might be able to read it with very little feeling in that sense. So yeah, it is it's not a one size maybe fits all kind of thing. And the other thing that's been mentioned, and I think it is really important, is, and I think this is always the question, how is what is being taught, is it detached from the personal behavior. So, for example, Wittgenstein, one of my, kind of one of my favorite philosophers, he frequented prostitutes. He had, there was a lot of kind of muck going on there. How much does that affect his philosophical investigations and his Tractatus and so on, which are basically math books? You know, I don't think very much. So those are kind of extremes, right? But if somebody's teaching or writing books about healthy marriage, and then you find these things out, well, that's a whole different thing because now the two are very connected. And figuring that out is the hard work I think that Dr. Shin has been talking about. And it is hard work, but I think we need to do it.
So if I can get your thoughts then on, we're talking about this restitution, the path to restitution, get your thoughts on the four examples we've talked about quite a bit, both last week and this week. And just your thoughts on the comparisons I'm drawing here. King David had his affair. We talked about that last week. He confessed and repented after he'd been busted by the prophet Nathan. But I'm not aware that he did anything else more than that. Certainly not restitution to his victims. And he's been fully restored because his writings are part of the Bible. Karl Barth acknowledged the pain it caused his wife, this relationship, but he didn't repent of the long-term adulterous relationship with Charlotte. He didn't publicly confess it as sin. And instead, he justified the relationship as necessary. It was a God-given part of his life and work, and his writings are still quoted and used. Ravi Zacharias also didn't confess. He even pushed back on his accusers. He also justified his sexual abuse as a God-given reward. And he went to his deathbed with all these issues still unresolved. So in many ways, Karl Barth and Ravi Zacharias are no different. They both push back on it. And then you have Philip Yancey. He voluntarily disclosed his secret before it was discovered, as far as we know, as far as I know. He voluntarily shut down his ministry and submitted himself to counseling and rehab before he was asked to do so. And he committed to rebuilding his relationship with his wife. So in that sense, he stands head and shoulders apart from what we saw in Karl and Ravi. Any thoughts?
I do agree that there are degrees of, repentance and restoration and restitution. I don't think we know enough about Yancey. I just want to say, I think there's some evidence that he may have been discovered that, is not public, but we're assuming that he confessed voluntarily and his wife committed herself to him. I don't know that that was the statement. And so I wouldn't quite put him in, I have more reservations about where he is at this point. So there are degrees and grades, but going back to what Sarah said before, we just tend to treat it as black and white. We tend to treat it like, oh, if you say you're sorry and you seek forgiveness, then you're going to be restored back to the very position that you were in. And that is simply not wise or acceptable in almost any case, and certainly not as quickly as we tend to do. So we do need to treat all of these repentances and confessions and restorations with degrees, and they need to be done over time, slowly, and the fruit needs to bear itself out, even the fruit of confession. But we're not willing to do that. And so that just contributes to the cycle of the systemic problems. And so we need to look at the problems on this end as well as at the end where they begin.
Yeah, I think David is complicated, right? Yes, his writings are included in scripture, but he is a horrendous father. And like the things that he reaps later in life come from, like when, we're not even talking about Bathsheba at this point. So I think, again, like when we think about the patriarchs of the Bible, almost all of them, like they struggle, they sin, they are not perfect. And so for David to be called a man after God's own heart, we need to wrestle with what that might mean. And so even when we're presenting these figures from the pulpit, these writers, like, again, I think it's important for us not to treat them as paragons, that they are people that wrestle with the Lord. And even if many Psalms are the ones that are written from David's hand, also like he is an imperfect sinner wrestling with the Lord. I think overall, no matter how the end happens or what we know about the end, whether they turn or not, does not then cut out the work for us of working through the middle. The middle is the work that we need to do, that we need to work through as we're thinking about, how do I read this person? So if 50 years from now, someone's preaching about Yancey, I would hope that they would say, like, there's this really this interesting quote. You should know that this was his life. And so this makes me handle this quote with a certain kind of care. I'm like, that feels like truthful versus saying the end justifies not having to, say some extra context for this writer's life. So no matter the end, I don't think you can skip the middle. In the work, we have to do the work of the middle. Yeah.
I've mentioned this before on the podcast that I've had a significant encounter with the Islamic faith over the last 10 years or so, because my daughter converted to Islam and is now raising an Islamic family and so on. And in my many discussions with various Islamic scholars, it's interesting. They are very offended by the Bible's frankness about people like Abraham and David. So, because if these guys are prophets, in their view of a prophet, they have to be near perfect. And it's a very different perspective on what it means to be a, quote, person of God than the biblical state. I mean, the most anti-Semitic book on the planet isn't Mein Kampf, it's the Bible. I mean, in the sense of, if you know what I'm saying, the very name Israel means fights with God, right? These are the people that fight with God. And so, I think that if that's the religious heritage that we have, why are we afraid to reckon with our own fights with God, with our own messy history and so on? It's kind of interesting to me that we do that, because the Bible doesn't tend to do that. It tends to the book of Job, my favorite book of all, same kind of thing, right? Questioning and the struggle. That our God is the God of the whirlwind, right? The God of chaos. Where's that all gone? I think evangelicals sanitize all that stuff. And then when we do that, we end up so shocked and so dismayed when these things occur. Sorry, I'm preaching a bit, but anyway, go ahead, Lou.
Okay, we have really gone quite long. There is so much more that I know I've got a lot of questions and a lot more things that need to be said, but we really need to draw a line under this one. I want to thank our guests, Dr. Shin and Dr. Swallow Prior, for giving us their perspectives, distinctive from each other and from ourselves, from our own as well. And I'd like just to promote a little bit of your work. Sarah, you're just releasing another book. You've written a couple books already, and I think there's another one on the way.
Oh, it's just come out. So my husband and I have written 2 children's books in the past year and a half. The one that's come out recently is an Easter one with Penguin Random House. It's called The Great Waking Up.
And he's the illustrator in that book.
Yes. It's a husband duo.
Very good. And Karen, you mentioned that there's one on the way.
Well, it's very early, so it's not on the way yet.
Okay.
But the one most relevant to, I think, this conversation is the one I mentioned, the evangelical imagination, how stories, images, and metaphors created a culture in crisis. And that is about social imaginaries in the evangelical context. And then I write a newsletter on Substack called The Priory, which is where I mainly talk about literature, but sometimes I talk about abuse and so forth. So folks can find me there as well.
Okay. We're going to have links in our show notes, as always, for both of our guests to their websites, and you can find those links to their books and other posts and things. So we will make sure that you can get it there. Thanks again, Dr. Shin, Dr. Swallow Prior. We really appreciated what you had to say.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great conversation.
Bye, Sarah.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.